it's a privilege to talk on this particular subject, not just because it's a favorite of mine, but because it is the most fundamental and important topic in theosophical teaching. It's the foundation of thing, really. In the Bowen notes, HPB is reported as saying, unity is the one fundamental law in occult science. So it's also challenging, and it's more so than ideas like planes and bodies and reincarnation, not least because it's quite obvious that each of us in this meeting are separate and not one. And it's difficult to talk about because there aren't the words. Some of you may remember Ianthe Hoskins. She was very fond of words, and she used to get very frustrating because of this lack of words. And she used to say, we have a word for something and a word for nothing, and we have a word for anything and everything, but I have to invent the word one thing. So I shall use the word one thing. And some of you may also remember Rada Bernier, and I heard her speak at a summer school on this topic. And I said to her afterwards that I was glad she'd tackled it because it's so important and difficult and so rarely talked about. And she looked at me in a long, piercing, rather appraising, doubtful sort of look, that eventually said, somebody's got to do it. And that was that. So here I am. I'm somebody and I've got to do it. The best place to start is probably wherever you happen to be. So I'll start with the physical. And I think it's still possible to sense something of the unity of things at that level. The Dalai Lama, for instance, teaches quite a radical approach to unity. He says, the fact is, all 6 billion human beings share one planet. We all live under one sun. We are today, especially, simply one community in the face of population growth, instantaneous communication, the modern global economy, and our common environmental problems. For each of us, the future is entirely dependent on the rest of humanity. We are really one entity, and in reality, there is no separate, independent, individual interest. What an interesting word. Our ways of thinking about things are still based on concepts inherited from the ancient times when each community lived more or less independently. And our outdated way of thinking gives us the mistaken view that we and our communities are separate from the rest of the world. Based on that, our actions are unrealistic. So if you know the Buddhist philosophy, you'll see there's a lot of things packed into that. But I quote it verbatim because it's actually worth a lot more attention than I can give it tonight. It comes from his teaching on Tsongkhapa's great treatise on the stages of the path. Because he's not alone in that argument. From the Lucis Trust's triangles network, I've picked up, rather than being isolated individuals, each of us is embedded within communities of relationship, within groups large and small. Even the soul with its individual essence is part of a group with a task to be performed in the unfolding plan, and so on. So actually, we're all familiar with those ideas, I think. And we're also familiar with the idea of group mind, being part of a group mind. Of course, you get the term group think as well. And this group mind has quite a powerful influence on our individual thinking. I think perhaps the Dalai Lama's comments are a reflection of that. Now, this group mind is an entity in its own right. It exists beyond the processing in the individual brains of people in a group. And it influences the minds of the people in the group in the same way as the Earth's magnetic field influences compass needles. So when you're in a group making a decision and everybody in your group is thinking the same thing, be aware. It's being taken over by a group consciousness. Because we normally focus our attention in our own brain consciousness and thinking, we aren't aware of being influenced, let alone the source of it. So when it leads us into mistakes and disasters, we don't learn from them because it wasn't our thinking. We just repeat them. We can see that through history. Now, there's a very similar idea from Rupert Sheldrake. Some of you may know his work. He talks about morphic fields. And he applies that to the mental realm as well as to developmental biology, which is where it originated. I once asked him whether he had encountered Leadbetter's writings on thought forms. And he said, yes, he had, but only after he developed the morphic fields theory, and the two are more or less equivalent. Well, of course, there are many other physical ways of illustrating unity, such as the fingers of your hand. You know, they're all part of one hand, aren't they? So they're sort of one thing. And your old friend in the kitchen, a blue bottle. Have you ever looked a blue bottle in the eye? No, it's not easy. But their eyes are not singular eyes like ours. They are complex things. They're, there's a word for it and it's escaped. But they're compound eyes, that's it. Instead of having a lens and a retina with a lot of sensors on, they have a lot of lenses, and each lens has its own sensor. The interesting thing is that each of these things points in a slightly different direction. So they get a completely different view of the world, and a fly's eyes cover almost all of its face, which is why it's very hard to creep up behind them and swat them. But that in that case, you see, you have lots and lots of elements in the eye, but they're all part of one eye. Now, to me, there is something quite unsatisfactory about those physical analogies. They deal in things that are part of some larger thing. And they don't capture the interpenetrative aspect of the individual being the whole of the unity. The teaching is that we are not a set of things tied together in a bundle, like a dozen sticks making a faggot. We are, each individually and corporately, the unity. It's what we are, and we are all it, all of it, all of us. And the closest I can get physically is an image of the classical Roman city, where you have a forum in the center, and it's surrounded by the various civic buildings, you know, the temples and the religious buildings, the basilica and the administrative buildings, and it's got market stalls and traders in it. And the citizens who live in the streets around it, they are citizens only because there is that city infrastructure. And they're entitled, indeed they're required, to attend and trade and vote and otherwise interact all over that forum. And the city is the citizens, and the citizens are the city. But even with that analogy, we're still dealing with things classified into groups. And all we've really established is that the hierarchy, and therefore, that we are at one level of a hierarchy, and therefore we're part of an entity at the next level up the hierarchy. And of course, we're composed of entities at a next level down in the hierarchy. And that's hardly an explanation of unity. And in my book, it simply won't do. Which brings me to my favorite diagram. And I think you may have seen this before. Right. Have you seen it before? No. And some of you may remember Helen Gething. I first met this star diagram as a purple poster which she brought to a meeting. And it comes from A. Powell's Causal Body, where it's unattributed. Elsewhere, Ledbetter ascribes it to a Mr. Prime and says, some of you, the older ones at least, may remember Mr. Prime. If there's anybody here who remembers Mr. Prime, they must be at least 100 years old. And he used to do a good deal of traveling and lecturing for society. He had a very sound belief in the advantage of diagrams to help people understand. He used to take with him a roll of big coloured diagrams and hang them up before his audience. And one of these was a suggestion as to unity. It was not at all a bad symbol. So this is it. And Powell in 1928 explains it like this. Says the tips of the spokes represented physical consciousnesses of men. So we're talking consciousnesses. That's important. They are separate and distinct from one another. Passing up the spokes towards the center, we see that the astral consciousness is a little wider, so that the consciousnesses of separate men approach a little nearer to one another. The lower mental consciousnesses approach still more nearly, while the higher mental consciousnesses at their very highest level meet at the point where the Buddhic consciousness commences. It will now be seen that the Buddhic consciousness of each individual and separate man overlaps that of the other separate consciousnesses on either side of him. This is a graphic illustration of the overlapping aspect of Buddhic consciousness, where a sense of union with others is experienced. And then he goes on to point out that the further in towards the center you go, the more the overlap is, until there is no separation at all. And each of the separate spokes, nevertheless, still exists. It has its own individual and different outlook. Looking towards the lower worlds, each consciousness looks in a different direction. It's an aspect of the one central consciousness. Looking inwards, on the other hand, these diverging directions all meet together and become one with one another. Well, I would say it is indeed not a bad symbol. It shows how, in fact, we are the one thing, manifesting as various aspects of ourselves on each plane or level of being. And since consciousness is what we are, and that consciousness is directed outwards through the physical body and brain, our experience is separateness, not the inner oneness. Okay, I'm going to come back and be with you again. Stop sharing, that's it. There you go. So it does in fact show us how we are this one thing manifesting as various aspects of it. Because it's only when consciousness is focused on its own plane, on the Buddhic plane, that we can directly experience that oneness. And this is where the overlapping begins in the diagram, where the individual and separate spokes occupy the same space, symbolizing their identity. So if I had to summarize the argument in 30 seconds, I'd say understanding this idea that we are a unity, a one thing, all depends on what you mean by we. If we are regarded as physical bodies that possess a mind and their own consciousness, then we're clearly separate, not in unity. If we're regarded as points of awareness in a sea of consciousness, which operates or manifests through various physical bodies, then it makes obvious sense. And if the one thing, or consciousness, exists at the bodic level, it's beyond mind and beyond language. So to understand it, we're going to have to devise ways of stimulating that level of inner knowing or intuition. And to put it a different way, we must devise ways of taking our attention away from the physical world and personality and focusing at its own level. Well, some of you may know that I made a meditation garden. It's laid out as a star with 8 points. And there are plantings like rose and raspberry between the points, representing what physical life throws at us. Always a thorn behind the rose, and life does tend to throw raspberries at you. There is a central area where all the spokes, as Powell calls them, are one. And there's a small pond in the center with a lotus. Now, I built it as a means of reaching an understanding and an experience of this unity, because when you're standing in it or sitting in it, you can match the physical movement from a point to the center with the shift of attention from outward manifestation to inward consciousness. And you can match the physical movement with the experience of oneself as a physical body at the point, through a mind and emotions in between by the plantings, and to experiencing oneself as the unity of multiple spokes in the center. You're literally and metaphorically changing the point of view from which you are conscious. Now, I discovered that Plotinus in the Enneads says of the one that in its exuberance, it as it were overflows into nous, that's consciousness, and looking back, knows itself as one, whilst itself overflowing into psyche, or mind. And this imagery caused me to arrange the tiny pond so that it overflows into the central area, and the water is carried out to the plantings that represent the thoughts and emotions. And the whole thing sits there radiating the idea of oneness. I also made a portable star diagram. Here it is. It looks like that. And you can see that we lay that on the floor with a candle in the center, and you have a rather nice image for a meeting. And I discovered something else that Plotinus says. There is something that is center, he says. About it, a circle of light. Note, light is a symbol of consciousness. And about that, yet another circle, which having no light of its own, must borrow. I think it's a splendid way to describe psyche, in which consciousness knows a reflection of itself. Right. Now, you might say that this star diagram is really just the old layer cake idea, but multiple versions of it, they're all points in the middle. And you know what I mean by a layer cake? No, I'm not seeing, I'm looking for, no, but I'm not seeing. Here's a layer cake from Aldi. You see, it's got 3 layers. So the creamy bit at the top is obviously your spirit, and this bit is the soul, and that's your physical body at the bottom, right? Who remembers Donald Atkinson and his sense of humor? He goes, What are these little white bits in between? They're layer centers. Right. Okay. Um, so you might think that what we just have with this diagram is multiple layer cakes. But the whole point is that it doesn't present the levels or planes of consciousness as things that we may each individually possess and experience and contemplate in splendid isolation. It shows that at the highest level, at least, it's not only what you are, but what all of us are. And we're all it, all of it. So using the star diagram for meditation really depends on the understanding that we are the consciousness of the one shining outwards as the attention that we put on the mental and emotional worlds in order to know them. Then the search for what I call the isness that knows, that is the self, or the presence of the self, that involves redirecting that light or attention back to its source. It's what the Advaita teachers call self-inquiry. It involves cultivating an increased intensity of awareness, so heightened consciousness, by searching for the faintest thoughts and emotions and sensations. Then asking yourself, are you these thoughts, etc., or are you the knower of those thoughts? Obviously, you're the knower, so can you find that isness that knows the self, the presence of that one? Now, for all the words and the explanations, and I've given you quite a few, for all that, the unity is still being treated as a thing to think about and look for and talk about, which it isn't. Therefore, we don't ordinarily sense it. We don't normally experience it as such. We don't know it innerly as ourself. In the layer cake, and indeed in the star diagram, the planes of consciousness are presented as a sequence of things, sequence of levels, like rungs on a ladder. But the relationship between them isn't really quite like that. And I thought it'd be worth exploring a different way of understanding that, starting with the one thing that isn't a thing. And here I shall need to go back and give you the pictures again. There we go. Right, the one. You can't say much about the one. At least you can, but you can't say much that's useful about the one. But here are four things. It is. It's infinite. So it has no boundaries, no limits. And therefore it contains everything, everything that is or was or might be, including nothing. And therefore you cannot ascribe any particular attribute to it, except isness and infiniteness. It's essentially without attributes. Anything that you can think of, including planes and consciousness, can only arise within it. So it can't be right to represent it as the top rung of a ladder or the top layer of a cake. Instead, I prefer to represent it as a circle, a white circle on a black background. I've done it like that for three reasons. It's infinite, so there's nothing outside of it, which is why around it is black. And there is no thing inside it because the everything it contains is unmanifest potential. And it has no attributes apart from isness and infiniteness. If something arises from it, then that something must arise within it and not under it or over it or anywhere else, because there is nowhere else. So there's something. So there's nothing in it, nothing around it, and it has no attributes apart from isness and infiniteness. So anything has to be in it. By now, some of you may be thinking, I've seen this somewhere before. And you have. In the proem to the Secret Doctrine, probably. And some of you may be also thinking, but he's just quoted Plotinus with something that is center and about it a circle of light. And then he gives us a picture that's the other way round or inside out. And of course, you're right. This is what happens when you try to talk about something that is beyond the range and reach of thought, as Blavatsky said. It's also why Plotinus hedges everything with phrases like, so to speak, and as it were, or as you might put it. It partly explains why HPB was constantly accused of contradicting herself. Mr. Prime would probably have some sympathy with my predicament here, because there are more diagrams to come. And if you've read the proem, you will know the diagram that comes next. Anybody guessing? Not that one? It's a horizontal diameter. Actually, that circle looks rather squashed. It's because the screen dimensions are different from my other computer. Okay, it's a line. It represents the next rung down the ladder. Notice that it's not below the one, it's within the one. And the one is around it and within it. Remember how Plotinus says the one in its exuberance, as it were, overflows into nous, while looking back knows itself as the one and in its turn overflows into psyche. Notice also the line has two ends, not just one. It's actually the next two rungs down the ladder. There, it's got two ends. Elsewhere in the Boyd notes, Blavatsky says, fundamentally, there is one being. This being is the absolute in its primary manifestation. So that's the whole circle. The being has two aspects, and here they are. Positive and negative. The positive is spirit or consciousness. The negative is substance, the subject of consciousness. Now, use of the words subject of consciousness is slightly misleading here, because consciousness is the subject, and what it's conscious of is the object. So it's actually subject and object. The distinction that she's making can also be labeled consciousness and psyche, as well as subject and object. In Plotinus's terms, these are nous and psyche, and we call them body and manas. So they're really layers 2 and 3 of a 7-layer cake. So these two ends of the line that arise in the one are a syzygy. Have I talked about syzygies before? Yes. So the dictionary tells me a few things about it. And by the way, here we have the one, but I've squashed it to get it on. And you've got your consciousness and mind, subject, object, with two ends of the line. Dictionary says that the syzygy is a pair which are yoked together. So you can't have one without the other. It's one thing in two states simultaneously. It's a pair of concepts which arise simultaneously. It's complementary yet irreconcilable objects, sorry, opposites. Now, syzygies tend to arise in hierarchies, and the ladder represents that. They can also be taken as principles or archetypes out of which the universe is built, and they connect with sacred geometry. But we're looking here at the beginning of duality arising out of unity, the one becoming two. And for now, I shall leave that and regroup these around a triangle. This. Because what we're seeing here is what you call technically emanation. The Simon Magus quote is quite nice. The one became manifest from itself and so passed into a state of duality. And how nicely that fits the definition of the syzygy, and how nicely it fits the nature of emanation. So I've grouped these round a triangle and labeled them. You've got your Atma Bodhimanas. You can see that the syzygy is the base of the triangle, and the one is at the apex. And it represents the arising of duality out of unity. It's the primal syzygy, the primal scission, or the original wound, maybe even the original sin. In Pythagorean or Platonic terms, this scission is the golden cut or the golden ratio. And in blue, you have quotations from the Gnostic teachers Simon Magus and from HPB describing it. And around the points, I've put sets of names used in different traditions and in the Christian tradition, because it's quite clear what you have here is the fundamental Trinity. The whole of manifestation flows from this Trinity. Sometimes it's said that the one makes itself manifest in order to know itself, because as nous, consciousness, it sees itself reflected in psyche and mind. Logically, we, as manifestations of the one, are encountering other manifestations of the one in order to know ourselves in the other. In human terms, as distinct from metaphysical terms, this trinity is what Blavatsky calls the upper triad. And the Bodhi-Manas syzygy is the spiritual ego, or the reincarnating ego. It's the self with a capital S, spiritual self. It's what knows the physical world through the lower mind and brain. And it's again what I call its isness that knows. Okay. And if you're still looking for analogies to help get your head around the meaning of this one, try the concept of a field, as in an electromagnetic field. It's homogeneous, isn't it? It's without boundaries. It produces and sustains effects within itself, permeating everything within it. The emanation of force is constant, continuous, and it's in the present. And it fits the descriptions I've given you, but it wasn't available to HPB. Of course, it's important to point out that with all these words and images and so on, it's not just for your intellectual amusement. These are meant to prepare us for the spiritual quest, for experience of the self and of the one. Because just as the one manifesting as nous or consciousness seeks to know itself reflected in psyche, we humans seek to know the self in our ordinary awakened consciousness. And that is where you come back to the self-inquiry. But I'm not going to run through that tonight because I think you probably want to talk about some of these things. And this is probably not the right place for doing a deep meditation. So I shall leave you with that image, except I shall switch it off so I can see you. There we go. And I'll stop there.